Hello, everybody. My name is Skylar, and welcome to this webinar presented by Influicity. Can everybody hear me? Can you ping me in the chat if you can hear me? Perfect. Beautiful. All right, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about custom podcasts and why many brands are taking the leap into creating podcasts of their own. Let me just lost control. There we go. Okay. So podcasts are experiencing a golden age right now. According to data gathered by the Infinite Dial in 2021, approximately 162 million people have interacted in some way with a podcast. Similar trends are rising worldwide. The Daily, a podcast published by the New York Times, is reported to have nearly 4 million listeners tuning in every day. That's more than the primetime viewership of the United States' most popular cable news network, Fox News. Even during 2020, a year that was difficult for most industries, podcasting experienced an increase in listenership and revenue, even though many people had stopped commuting and doing other activities that they typically engage in while listening. The massive popularity of podcasts has attracted the attention of marketing experts from a wide variety of industries. You'd be hard-pressed to find a podcast on the air today that doesn't feature sponsorships and ad space. Some brands even go on podcast tours. A representative expert does guest interviews on a number of relevant podcasts to raise awareness for the brand or promote a particular product. While both of these methods can be incredibly lucrative, some brands are taking it one step further and starting their own podcasts. Some of the world's biggest brands like McDonald's, Trader Joe's, Shopify, and BMO are now publishing their own content in the podcasting space. And the trend is only expected to grow in coming years. But why are brands opting to spend the time and money to create their own content when they could really just buy ad space on any number of shows? What's the attraction for creating your own content? In this webinar, we're going to examine why branded podcasts are the new frontier in marketing, why they're worth the time and money it takes to make them, and how they can take your brand to the next level. In the past, brands have mainly engaged with the podcast space in two ways, with sponsorships and by doing podcast tours. Sponsored ads can be found in almost every podcast that airs today. Direct-to-consumer companies such as HelloFresh were forerunners in this market, but the advertising space quickly expanded to play host to a huge variety of industries and products. Ad space is typically sold in two forms. Companies either purchase the right to insert pre-produced standard ad spots into podcasts, or they work with the podcast hosts to create host-read endorsement for their products. And either way has been found to work incredibly well in the podcasting space. Podcast tours are also fairly common in terms of podcast advertising. Being able to get in front of a huge audience by leveraging the listenership of different podcasts makes these tours really excellent options for brands who are kind of testing the waters in the podcasting market. Both of these strategies can be incredibly lucrative. According to the Podcast Consumer Survey in 2019, 54% of podcast listeners are likely to act on the advertising they hear on podcasts. And for a long time, this was the end of most brands' engagement with podcasting. Podcasts aren't very good for increasing your email list or adding to your social media following. So brands avoided putting too much effort into this space because it wasn't providing the kind of quantitative numbers that other platforms could give them. However, there's been a recent shift in marketing that puts more emphasis on brand engagement and creating a relationship with the consumer. This is where podcasts shine. They're the ultimate tool for building brand awareness, creating a unique brand experience, and building trust in your audience. Podcasts can even generate highly valuable leads and create sales. Let's take a closer look at the benefits of creating your own branded podcast. The first major benefit of creating a podcast for your brand is the audience. Podcast audiences are unique. They're diverse, highly engaged with the content, and much more likely to act on the advertising that they hear. Demographically, podcast audiences are a richly diverse group. 43% of monthly podcast listeners are non-white, and many fall into the 16 to 34 age range. The rise of podcasts for children is contributing to even more diversity amongst this group, and as more and more shows are created, the potential audience only expands. Notably, a significant percentage of podcast listeners can be classified as ad avoiders, people who change their behavior specifically to avoid advertisers. This gives branded podcasts the potential to create kind of a unique cut through to an audience that would otherwise be very difficult to reach. Additionally, podcast audiences are more engaged than any other audience type. The amount of time that listeners will linger on the content is much longer, and the likelihood that they will act upon the things that they hear in a podcast is much higher. They make a conscious choice to tune in, making their relationship with the content completely different than their relationship with other forms of advertising or social media. The unique way that podcast audiences consume content greatly affects a podcast's effectiveness as well. Roughly 94%, I'm going to repeat that number for you because it's crazy, 94% of podcast listeners consume podcasts while engaged in other activities. Driving, doing chores, cooking, exercising, and running errands are all common things that people do while they listen. This separates podcasts from other types of media, such as TV, which usually is the focus of the viewer's attention. The result of this unique type of listening is something that neurologists call low involvement processing. This is where your brain absorbs content in a more energy efficient manner because you're also engaging in another activity. Content that is consumed in this way tends to stick in the minds of the audience much longer than content consumed in another manner. Podcasts can also be an effective tool for reaching an audience that's important to brands in another way: employees. According to a study conducted by Popula of internal communication professionals, over 30% of them still struggle with knowing which channel to use to reach specific audiences within a company. Creating a branded podcast has been found to increase employee engagement and even employee retention. They can be used to help employees connect with the brand that they're working for, keep up to date on news from the company and the industry that they work in, and even create a community by featuring employees from different departments. The second major benefit of creating a branded podcast has to do with what the advertising industry refers to as attention economy. Essentially, the sheer amount of information that we have access to in the digital age creates a fiercely competitive space for people's attention. Attention is a resource, and it's so precious that companies are having to constantly innovate in order to get their share of it. In most advertising spaces, there's so much competition for users' attention that you usually only have a matter of seconds to connect with your audience. Many ads are specifically interrupting activities that a user wants to engage in, like TV shows or games, creating the animosity that we see in ad avoiders and the resulting behaviors. For a podcast, the attention economy is completely different because listeners are actively choosing to engage with the content. Brands have more time to connect with consumers, and that time is so valuable. Think about it like sitting down with current and future customers one-on-one in their own homes. This difference plays out in the numbers as well. The average listen through time for a branded podcast is 28.5 minutes with an 85% completion rate. That's 14 times the engagement time of video content, which has a watch through rate of roughly 2 minutes before experiencing a significant drop off, with a completion rate of only 25%. And podcast listeners tend to be loyal, with a high rate of repeat listeners. If video content and social media provide crumbs of attention, branded podcasts give you the whole pie. The third benefit of creating a branded podcast actually lies in the content itself. Despite the fact that podcasting is experiencing its golden age and over 4 million shows currently exist, the market is far from saturated. This allows brands to explore their own voice and create something that's unique to them while still being able to gain a lot of traction really quickly. Creating a branded podcast allows you to own your brand's voice rather than just kind of renting space in other people's content. Additionally, podcast content is remarkably evergreen. Because it's safe from the ever-shifting feeds of social media, content that is years old will still draw hundreds or even thousands of new listeners every month. That unique feature gives podcasting a much higher return on investment than other types of content like video content or social media posts. Podcast content can also be easily repurposed into content for other platforms, such as, you use clips on social media, videos for YouTube, and transcripts that get turned into blog posts. The cascade also works well in the other direction. Content such as virtual events, seminars, and blog posts can be repurposed into podcasts as well, making them highly valuable. Beyond the raw numbers of leads and sales that a podcast has the potential to produce, many brands are finding that the real dividends are coming from consumer engagement. Branded podcasts are unmatched tools for creating positive associations with the brand backing them. Creating informative, entertaining content is a way for a brand to give back to its community and foster relationships with the people that brands care about most, their consumers. Podcasts humanize brands to listeners and bring brand values to life in a comfortable, intimate storytelling format that has proven to be incredibly effective in brands' marketing strategies. And as long as brand mentions are authentic, organic, and applied with a discerning hand, they aren't even seen as an intrusion in podcast content. The other main benefit of creating a branded podcast in terms of brand awareness is cementing yourself as an authoritative voice on the subject of your choice. You're showcasing your brand's effectiveness and power in the industry, which can greatly affect your customers' buying decisions. And we'll get to questions at the end of the show. I'm just seeing some stuff coming in, sorry. Our next benefit is their effectiveness, and this is the main benefit. Oh, move on. There we go. And all of these stats came from an absolutely fascinating neuroscience study that was conducted by BBC Global News. And according to this study, brand mentions within podcasts tend to stand out from the content surrounding them. This kind of neurological quirk produces 16% higher engagement and 12% higher memory encoding than most of the content that you'll find in a podcast. The same study found that this level of engagement with brand mentions in podcasts fosters marked increases in favorable consumer behavior. And that comes out to 89% higher brand awareness, 57% higher branded consideration, 24% higher brand favorability, and 14% higher purchase intent. These remarkable numbers make podcasting a veritable powerhouse of brand messaging. Because brand mentions are not seen as an intrusion in the context of podcast content, brands have the time and ability to foster relationships with their audience and expose them to more brand messaging, sort of kind of without being pushed away. Considering that consumers typically need to be exposed to brand messaging 25 to 30 times before they will take action on it, branded podcasts create more valuable opportunities to create loyal, active consumers. And now we've got a couple of case studies for you guys. We've seen the massive dividends that a custom podcast can pay out firsthand with Business Unplanned, a custom podcast that we produce for the Bank of Montreal, also known as BMO. Business Unplanned is a financial podcast hosted by entrepreneur Michael Hyatt, who interviews incredible guests from the financial industry to give Canadian business owners valuable insights on investing, tax strategy, and topics like that. Business Unplanned is entering its third year of production, and we've seen incredible results as it has grown and developed. According to a ComScore branded content survey that we conducted in 2020, Business Unplanned has generated meaningful lift in brand awareness, recall, and consideration for BMO in its audience, and has been a significant driver of new clients for the company, including individuals with a high net worth. We've actually seen so much success with this podcast that we've implemented an annual virtual event into its content cascade, which will hopefully create even more results for BMO in the future. Business Unplanned isn't the only podcast we've seen major success with either. We also produce the Manjeet Minhas podcast on behalf of Shopify. This podcast is also aimed at small businesses, but it specifically targets audiences who are making the shift to e-commerce in the digital age. Manjeet Minhas is a very well-known Canadian entrepreneur who features on our version of Dragon's Den. And she interviews big players in the business world, people like Fortune 500 leaders, startup CEOs, and other successes that can provide advice and inspiration from their own journeys in being a business and starting their own businesses. After releasing the Manjeet Minhas podcast in November 2020, so remember this podcast is only a couple of months old, we've already seen huge growth in its audience. It launched at number 9 on Apple Podcasts, just behind the Gary Vee audio experience, and it attracts thousands of weekly listeners. Its high library value means that new listeners are discovering it every day. Shopify has experienced a marked uptick in online chatter around their brand since the podcast launched, including over 250,000 social shares, many of which included hashtag Shopify. We're really excited to see what heights this podcast is going to reach as it continues to run. In the end, branded podcasts are the future of marketing. The audience is unique, engaged, and more likely to act on the brand messaging they hear. Podcasts provide a doorway into highly competitive attention economies. They foster a high level of brand awareness, and the content can be easily repurposed into a variety of other things. Their effectiveness suggests that the shifting trend towards branded podcasts as a cornerstone of marketing strategy is only going to grow with time. And that's the end of my webinar here. I know I saw a couple of questions come up in here. So Christina, hi. The completion rate stat for branded podcasts that we found, or rather that a study, I believe this is the BBC study, found that they have a listen through time, so that's the time people will typically listen, of 28.5 minutes. So almost half an hour that they're managing to hold people's attention with an 85% completion rate. So 85% of listeners will finish the content. In comparison to video content has a watch through rate of about 2 minutes before it will drop off significantly. And the completion rate for video content typically hovers around 25%, and that's a stat gathered by YouTube. In terms of the comm plan, absolutely, Christina, it really varies from podcast to podcast. These are fully turnkey. We produce them ourselves. So the plans, we do all of the social media, we do all of the promotion for the podcast, as well as producing the content. And of course, we use influencer hosts for these. So they use their own kind of followings that they've already built to spread these as well. Paid promotion depends on the show, and I can't disclose whether we've used paid promotion for a show. It depends on the plans that we've built for our clients. I know I want to talk about the nitty-gritty of the process, but I can't. Unfortunately, we kind of have to be good to our clients and keep that information under wraps. But they definitely have a big part in being a marketing strategy for all brands, for any brand. Does anybody else have any questions before I sign off? Yes, absolutely. So podcasting content, by virtue of being audio, the recording of this webinar will go up onto our website. Our webinars are on demand. But in terms of Christina's question here, podcasting is really simple to transform just because you take the audio from your live streams or your event and you edit it and make sure it's good to be shared in a podcast format, and then you publish it. It doesn't require a lot of manipulation, I should say. And then vice versa, you can take a blog post and read it out on the air, and that becomes a podcast episode. So the transference for podcast content tends to be really high, and we find that they cascade very well. Okay, everybody, you all have been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming to see me today. If you like this kind of stuff, please don't forget to follow us on all of our social media platforms. You can find us at Influicity and subscribe to the YouTube channel. The webinars go up on there as well. And if you really, really like us, you can share it with a friend. We really love it when people share us. It means so much to us. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.